Hi, this is my Module 9 case study. Section 1 summarized the case. Assistant Principal Inman was working with a group of young men from the South Side at his school, Racket Junior High, who are a bit rough around the edges. He was hopeful that progress was being made, especially with a particular student, James. He later realized that this student had been tardy multiple times and had to call him to the office to discuss the situation. There was an exchange of property in the hallway between two boys. A teacher witnessed this and reported it, assuming that maybe a drug deal had gone on or some sort of exchange. She said James was the first boy involved in the interaction, and the second boy, David, seemed very nervous about what was happening. The exchange ended up being a set of brass knuckles. The principal pulled in both students at the same time to discuss what had happened, and when David was searched, they found the brass knuckles in his possession. Possession of brass knuckles was illegal, which resulted in both boys being arrested. The first boy, James, owned the brass knuckles while the other was forced to hold them. James admitted that they were his brass knuckles and that he told David he would beat him up if he didn't hold on to them for him. However, the officer said since it was in possession of David, he had to arrest him as well. The boy David, who was asked to hold it, he was an honor student who had never had any discipline issues and who Principal Eamon didn't even really know or have exchanges with because he was such a good student. Whereas James, who Mr. Eamon had been working with to connect with, was under multiple discipline issues throughout the year. Section 2, to report any legal or ethical issues. So the legal information that we know is that the possession of brass knuckles is considered a felony offense. James admitted guilt of owning and forcing David to hold these. The school officer heard this information yet still arrested both boys. And we know that there would be some sort of reprimand from the school board if Richard, the principal, does not write up both students. Some of the ethical information that we're presented with is that both boys should probably not have been pulled in at the same time for questioning, especially in this situation where I believe that David was being bullied and threatened into holding this weapon. The way that the case study read, we don't even know if there was enough time for David to tell a trusted teacher that this had happened in the time that the interaction occurred and the time that the questioning occurred. We also know that this was quite a breakthrough for James to admit his own guilt and to say that the brass knuckles were his and own up rather than allowing David to take the blame. We know that David had no previous discipline issues, is an honor student who is involved in music. And like I stated earlier, we don't know if he even had enough time to tell a teacher about what had happened before being called down. Richard now must choose between his own current and future success and well-being or David's. Both boys were receiving discipline, and Richard is determining whether or not he should proceed with discipline action for David since they were not his and he had never had any discipline issues before. So section 3 is to synthesize the entire situation in one sentence. Richard has been presented a difficult situation in which he must determine whether he will discipline a student, which would negatively impact the student and his future success and well-being, or if Richard will risk his own career by standing up for this student instead. So when we come to the facts, we know the people, the place, and the program involved in this case study. So first of all, our people, we have James, who is 15. He has a history of discipline issues. He's a little bit rough around the edges. David, who's an honor student with no previous issues, involved in the school band, and seemed to be, I would say, a victim in this situation. Richard Inman, he's a first-year assistant principal in this school. He himself was from the South Side, like James, which is part of the reason he wants to build connection with those students. The resource officer, who stands by the fact that both boys were involved, so both boys should be arrested. James's mother, who stated that he deserves the discipline and needs to start making better decisions. And David's mother, who's shocked, very concerned about how this will affect David's future. Where did this take place? At Rocket Junior High School. It's a school of 900 students, many of which are from the South Side. It also took place in the hallway where the exchange happened and in the school office where the interview happened. The program was disciplinary alternative education program. This is where the students would be required to attend instead of school for set periods of time. In this case, their detention there would be 45 days. Section 5 is to review and prioritize the information. So first of all, could the conflict, situation, or decision be damaging to stakeholders or to the community in general? I believe that the community would be affected because the decisions may become known. If that were to happen, students would know that the conflict had taken place and the decisions were made to punish both students. And I believe that this may involve or convince future students to not inform teachers out of fear of being punished for not standing up to bullies, or others may use this as a way to find out or pressure other peers to get into trouble. So what I mean by that is David was forced to do this and was frightened. He was threatened by James, and he was probably very afraid and didn't really know how to react. And if he is disciplined now in this situation, I think that's blaming the victim almost. We're telling the bullies that it's okay to threaten and to force others to do things against their will because they're going to be punished no matter what as well. What individuals and groups have an important stake in the outcome? I would say James. He's involved in the outcome, obviously, because he's going to be affected and have to go to the detention center. He had been improving and working with Mr. Inman and finally accepted responsibility for his own actions, which was a huge accomplishment. So while the principal was feeling pride for James, he also knew he had made a big mistake and was going to have to face disciplinary action for that. David and his family. David had never been in any trouble, really didn't do anything deserving to be in trouble in this situation, and was arrested for being bullied into doing something. And I think that's a terrible situation for a student to be in. I think as a parent, I would be very mortified to know that my student who was bullied was then being arrested for not standing up to another boy, especially when David, we know, is 13 and James is 15, so they're not even probably in the same grade. And I think that's really tough for a younger student to stand up to an older student. Richard is also going to be involved he has an important stake in the outcome. He was told that if he doesn't charge both boys or write up the paperwork for both boys to be sent to the detention center, that his career would be negatively affected. He would be reprimanded. And honestly, I think in this situation, the way that they're presenting this information tells me that his career could be negatively affected whichever way he chooses. I think the parents of David could make a big to-do and would have some legal standing to do so about this situation, and that could negatively affect Richard. And I also think that if he doesn't write up David, the director of secondary ed made it pretty obvious that he would be in trouble for that as well. Have all the relevant stakeholders been consulted? All of the stakeholders that I talked to about previously who had an important or high stake in the outcome of the decision have been notified. However, I believe that the principal, a school counselor, and possibly the superintendent should be informed of this situation, and their opinions should be taken into consideration as well. I think that together they can work to evaluate, communicate about, and advocate for ethical and legal decisions. I think that it's really tough if only one person makes a final decision. So if I were Principal Inman, I would make sure to talk to my principal, my head supervisor, maybe the school counselor, and like I said, the superintendent before making any major decisions. Can I personally learn more about the situation? I think it would be tough for me to learn more about the situation as it had already happened and I was given all the information that I was given. If I was in this situation, I would be asking for help and guidance as much as possible. As a first-year teacher, you have to reach out to people who have been doing it longer than you and ask for their guidance, and I think the same would be true about being a first-year principal, even just a principal in general. I'm still daily asking for help from my coworkers, and if I stepped into a leadership role, I would also need to be asking for help from those who, my colleagues who have been doing the job longer than me. Do I know enough to make a decision? I believe I have enough information to make a decision. If I didn't feel like I had enough information to make the decision, I would ask for more information. I would try to do more research and dig up more strategies, more ethical and legal documentation so that I could figure out what my decision would be. Section 6 is to identify options and possible consequences. Number one would be no action taken, and just letting both boys be arrested and taken to the detention center. I think if there is no action taken, then students who are bullied will begin to feel unsafe in that school. They will no doubt find out that this happened and will feel there is no rules against threatening students. I think this will be negative, a huge negative in this school environment, because the students who are bullies will know that they kind of have free reign, and the students that are bullied or threatened will not feel safe to tell. If I were David and I knew that if I would have told on James, and I still would have gotten in trouble because I was the one who was possessing these brass knuckles, I would never have told. I wouldn't have felt safe. I wouldn't have felt like I had an ally, and I would have been more scared than ever to know that I couldn't tell an adult without there being consequence for me being bullied or threatened. Option number 2, file the paperwork for both David and James to be sent to DAP. James and David would serve 45 days in the detention center. David would struggle to regroup when he returns to school. He would be falling behind academically. He might lose his academic standing as an honor student. He might lose his position in the band. I think David would really struggle being in an environment with students who I think were more described like James, as a little rough around the edges, or willing to carry or possess brass knuckles when it's very obvious that David is not this type of student. And I think for James, it would be detrimental to his learning and his career, future as well. While I do believe James deserves a consequence of some sort for owning and bringing brass knuckles to school, I do feel that it will negate his progress as working towards making better decisions and life choices. The final option is to file paperwork for James, as he openly admitted that the weapon was his, and allow David to remain in the school setting. A consequence here, Richard will be reprimanded by the director of secondary ed, which will definitely affect his career. Some possible consequences, David will be able to stay in school and will know that his principal advocated for his future success. And I think that second consequence that could happen is more of a positive consequence than anything.